African source water protection community. And I'm excited to hear your questions or comments at the end. So I think everyone knows this, but this is the foundation on this call, but the foundation of our strategy as we communicate externally to partners and internally within the Nature Conservancy about the situation in Africa. Rapid population growth. We're going to see more than doubling of the population by 2050 in the continent, and most of that in urban areas. Those urban areas are already stretched in terms of their water supply right now, and that's both due to gray infrastructure challenges, actually connecting networks and last mile issues, but also due to land degradation in the source water areas, deforestation, expanding agriculture, which will only accelerate as the need to feed even more people comes online. And we're seeing the sedimentation, the decreased runoff, increased nutrients that many of you all see in your watersheds. So our strategy focused on source water protection is about changing that situation with restoration. Those and for through protection and restoration of both terrestrial and freshwater systems, but importantly, it also benefits rural and urban development if done right. And as we'll talk about and we'll feature later in this call, it can and I think we think should be adapted through using the water fund approach to river basins that might not just be urban water supply basins, but may have other values. So we'll talk more about that later. So just continuing with the situation analysis, this is analysis that we did and included in the report of a whole range of cities and what the land cover is in their source water areas. And you can see enormous variation from predominantly agricultural in Addis Ababa and Eldoret, two places where we're looking at water funds with partners, down to very forested, like in places like Sierra Leone, Freetown, where we're also looking at a partner-led water fund. And so the situations vary, and you basically in that that range, you've moved from more of a restoration approach to source water protection to a protection-based approach at the bottom. But all can be valuable and depending on the situation. And one of the most important things is taking stock of that and seeing how green infrastructure can make a difference. So here is, again, the Nature Conservancy's goal that we hope that you guys will adopt if you're not part of TNC directly. By 2025, we want investment in source water protection that's reduced the risk of water supply disruption to quality or quantity issues for 25 million people in Africa, improve the quality and or flow in 10 river basins, well, 5 of which at least half of which will have high biodiversity values, terrestrial or freshwater values, or both. Improve land use management across at least 1.8 million hectares, and improve livelihoods, rural livelihoods in particular, for at least 100,000 people. So we think by partnering with folks on this call and more broadly in the water community we can have these outcomes in the next 6 years. And this overall strategy, as I mentioned, includes a water funds component, which is what this network's been most focused on, and with an urban water supply entry and iconic basins, which we consider basins in which the entry point isn't the urban water supply utility, but rather a broader array of values. So some more specifics, how do we, those really broad outcomes, how do we get from, what are we actually changing on the ground working with others? So by 2020, we want at least 5 TNC-led water funds in operations, at least 7 partner-led water funds in operation, at least 7 additional water funds that are partner-led under development, and at least 2 of these iconic basins, these non-urban water supply entries, using the water fund model impact. So just to unpack that a little bit, I'll talk a little bit more about situations in which TNC thinks that it, as an institution leading a water fund, could be valuable, and how we will support partners to lead water funds. And you can see the majority in this plan are perceived as partner-led. And sorry, I didn't mention the 5 pillars of outcomes in this figure. I'll just talk through each of them really quickly. So outcome 2, which is this water sector spending, we recognize that to actually achieve the necessary impacts on the ground, investments in green infrastructure and source water protection need to increase at least tenfold. We're going to target international finance institution programs in at least 3 countries to revolutionize the way they're investing, not just in gray infrastructure, but green infrastructure. Change the investments of at least 5 public funders and at least 10 private funders. So a lot that underneath that, but the point is changing the way finance flows and getting it towards source water protection and green infrastructure. Our third outcome is policy. We all know that good policy is a necessary condition for lasting results. So working with, and we know that there's some good policies out there in existence. So we want to work at least with 2 or more national agencies to apply existing policies and fully implement them for source water protection. We want to work with countries to design new ones and make sure that we've got at least 1 regional policy framework, such as East African Community or SADC, reinforcing source water protection effectively. Our outcome 4 is you all know well, because it's the water fund network and really building that out for water sector practitioners across a broad set of geographies. And then we want to launch in the next year, actually, an Africa source water protection partnership that has deep engagement for institutions, both private and government institutions, to really drive that finance and awareness aspect of the work. And our first opportunity is the Nairobi 2020 Congress, which, if we haven't talked about it before, we'll talk about a future call in April, where we want to really catalyze this source water protection partnership. And prior to that, really have each of your inputs on what it can be and how best it can be effective. So a little more on geographies. Things are changing quickly. These slides are actually a little out of date already. But just to highlight, the figure on the left is in dark blue, shows a couple, the TNC-led ones that we'd agreed on September 2018, so Nairobi and Cape Town, and then some partner-led ones that are under development. I see folks from Port Elizabeth, the Algoa Water Fund on the call, Mombasa, Tanga, Addis, all moving forward quite well in terms of partner-led water funds. We also see Freetown and Eldoret now kind of jumping ahead as water funds that look very promising. And you can see some of the other places that we and partners are scoping or screening. Scoping is just a little bit more advanced version of screening. And so, yeah, back to the TNC-led versus partner-led distinction. What we mean by that is partners are always going to be key in all these water funds, but TNC, like it has in Nairobi and Cape Town, plays leadership role in staffing and fundraising, particularly in the early phases, takes on that responsibility, has staff on the ground. Partner-led is supporting others to achieve that, but still, if we are asked, we're involved in supporting those institutions to achieve the goal and move through the water fund process. So in this strategy, we set out something that I think many of us know pretty well, but what are some of the enabling conditions for expansion of water funds? And you see in this map, many more cities where we think there might be viability for water funds are demonstrated. And so we just want to keep our eyes on the ball on what are good enabling conditions. Recognition that there is a water security threat. If no key players see that there's a problem, we're not going to get much momentum to address it. Some of these problems really have no nature-based solution, or little nature-based solution opportunities. In some cases, you really do just need either heavy regulation or a gray infrastructure approach to dealing with the challenge, like from toxic chemicals, for example. So you need to have that potential for nature-based solutions to play a role. Size of a watershed. We know that we're unlikely to have much success in at least a full-blown water fund approach for Kinshasa in the Congo basin, since they take their water from the lower Congo. We want to be able to have a small enough area that there's a link between the users and the upstream population that doesn't have too many transaction costs. Sound governance, water governance legislation that can help establish a water fund, or the potential for that legislation. Some financial resources, both public and private sector, and good implementers and catalyzers are critical. We know not all those enabling conditions are always met right from the start, but they're really important checkoffs before we enter into these new projects associated with the strategy. And then just to be transparent about what kind of conditions are important for the Nature Conservancy to lead, which again should be a minority of water funds, hopefully, is presence of a TNC office currently or projected in the future, terrestrial or freshwater biodiversity value. We're really very interested in being able to have geographic representation across the continent so that we're able to translate the model in different portions, in different contexts, culturally and ecosystem-wise, and a diversity of conservation interventions. Already in Cape Town and Nairobi are very different in what they do, and we're interested in diversifying even further. Probably goes without saying that finance will play a critical role if we're really going to scale this up. I think I'm going to gloss over this slide just in the interest of time, but what I'm trying to get across with this, that the more we can finance institutions and talk their language about how green infrastructure can play a role and to help achieve long-term goals, and then think about how to match a financial flow to that approach. So investment in watershed conservation upfront is usually what's necessary through an initial large slug of investment in the first year or the first few years, and then there's a maintenance phase after that. So it's about how do we take project finance, bonds, venture capital, and potentially even premium recapture, such as tariffs and other insurance and other approaches to bring in the financial markets and more creative finance into the way water funds proceed going forward. So that's something that under our strategy we want to explore further. And our theory of change really is that we're at the early stages of this curve, this diffusion of innovation curve, where folks on this call are really in the early adopters phase. You know, creative people within that are build that broad set of stakeholders through awareness, mobilization, and action, through the network, through partnership, and through bringing in a broader set of institutions, so that we're able to, over time, transform the way folks think about source water protection and urban water security across the continent. And I think to do that, we need to talk a bit more about people, not just about the land and the water. Sustainable development goals are one really good way to talk about water funds and source water protections. I think we should be rattling off SDG 6, 8, 15, and potentially others as core to what we're all trying to do and what we're trying to do in this strategy. And at least I've been really impressed with the progress of the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund on this factor, and I think a lot of the partnerships and the mileage we've gained with partners through that water fund has been because of the impacts to people in terms of economic growth, livelihood improvements, and water access. So what I want to do is then end just talking a little bit about these iconic basins, which we're open to better names than that if you prefer. But the idea is picking working on a few places where this water fund model that you know well could be adapted to challenges of maybe a bit more diverse and sometimes a bit larger landscapes, where the urban water utility is not the entry point, where it's not centered around one or a set of intake points for the urban water utility, but more broad. It's a priority landscape for us at the Nature Conservancy and for the global community, that downstream users can provide funding or leverage public funding to make a difference for source water protection. And so using that model to have source water protection success. A few places that we're piloting this out, either ourselves or with partners, is the Overberg region, the Palmite Basin in South Africa, and the Bay Como in Gabon. I think you'll hear a bit more about South Africa, but in Gabon, that's focusing on a hydropower-based water fund, basically, where getting the incentive for protection and restoration around a small cascade of hydropower dams that provide the majority of power to Libreville. And then Cebu Basin in Morocco, which I think you've heard from before, where WWF is leading a more multifaceted approach to source water protection, recently being able to declare some headwater Ramsar sites and raising awareness across a multi-dam system for a really critical basin for North Africa. We're actually doing a training for basins such as these, particularly those that have a transnational character, on May 31st at the Global Environmental Facility IW Learn Africa workshop next week. And we will continue to kind of experiment on how the water fund model might be useful or might be effectively adapted. And you'll obviously hear about that more in a little bit. think I'm exactly at my 20 minutes. So I'll stop there, and thanks for your attention. Florence, do I take questions right now or later? Sorry.
Oh yeah. So about questions, we might we'll have 2 minutes people to type them in the chat. Then we'll have 15 minutes later after the presentations to answer all the questions. Typing it in the chat is to make sure that we don't miss any questions. So I'll give you 20 minutes, guys. We type them in the chat, then we can continue to the next presenter.
Great. And while we're doing that, is it, sorry, is Sahoa up next?
Luis.
Share his screen?
Luis, yes.
Luis, can you share your screen?
Yes, I'm sharing. Can everybody see it?
Not yet.
Tell me when you can see it.
Yes, we can see it now.
No, we can see it.
Okay, now I just need to get the thing to work. So good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be on this call, and thank you, Florence, for the opportunity to share a bit about the water funds in Southern Africa, the approach that we follow when deciding on developing or pursuing a water fund for a specific geography. And then I'm going to share some lessons that at the end of the call about the progress in South Africa specifically, and then have some insight should you have questions about critical issues that you may wonder about. So tell you what you can expect from this call about developing water funds in Southern Africa, what's the approach that we follow, and share a bit more about South Africa and then the lessons. So when we decide to develop water funds in Southern Africa, there's basically 2 angles that we take. The one is Colin shared with you the source water protection strategy, where cities or geographies have already been identified as potential water funds. But then we often, as municipalities and other partners start hearing about water funds and become more visible in Africa, there are questions from partners and municipalities to establish a water fund. But not all water challenges can be addressed through water funds. A water fund can simply, and Colin also mentioned that, not always work in all instances. So there may be a time, and there often happens, where we say, no, a water fund is not the appropriate model. But if a water fund seems to be an appropriate model, then we go through the stages: feasibility, design, creation, operation, and maturity, like all other water funds. So oops, I think I moved. So let me quickly show you where we're standing in South Africa specifically. There are 6 water funds. One Cape Town water fund has now been established and it's operational. 5 other water funds in different stages, and you can already see 3 of the 5 that's not in the water fund strategy, and these are some of the water funds that we received requests, and we're currently looking at whether water funds are indeed a model that can be pursued to address the water security issues in those areas. We also have a combination of very good partners that we're working with, and in South Africa, Cape Town Water Fund will be a TNC-led water fund, and the rest are going to be partner-led water funds. So I'm now going to go ahead with sharing some of the lessons that we learned, and I'm going to talk about 3 lessons. One is about governance, the other one about implementation, and then finally about financing. So we're answering 3 questions through these lessons, or through the experiences that I'm going to share. The governance is who is involved in a water fund, and the implementation in 2018. We now have an understanding of the size of the problem. We have an understanding of the priorities for the water fund. We quantified the cost. We have a steering committee, and we have some time frames to implement this business case to get the water security benefits that we modeled. But I find that the moving between the business case and implementation is probably one of the most challenging times, because it all boils down to fundings. You can have a Rolls-Royce of a water fund business case, but if one doesn't have the funding that will give the action to the business case, that can fund the activities that were identified, then it's like having a Rolls-Royce without fuel in the tank. So I'm going to share some of the lessons that we learned on governance. So when we talk governance, we talk about who is involved and who do we bring into the conversation and the development of a water fund. And the one group is the steering committee, and the other is the stakeholders. And it's all about managing expectations. So when we work with institutions or individuals, is to make them feel that they're part of the solution, not to exclude them. They must be clear on understanding their role, and then what mandate. When we talk about stakeholders, what are their mandates? Often in a geography, there's a lot of stakeholders, government and private sector. So what are they supposed to be doing, and what are they expected to do, and how can one move if the objectives of the water fund need to be achieved? How can one move all these stakeholders and steering committee members to align around the objectives of a water fund? And communication is essential right from the start. When we talk about implementation, the what is coordination of activities. Who does what? What are the actual on-the-ground activities that will give effect to a business case? And monitoring evaluation is crucial. Monitor the impact of what one set out in the business case to do, monitor the effectiveness of the activities, and then evaluate whether we're achieving the objectives that you set out in the business case. And prioritization is crucial, because prioritization assists with a systematic implementation. You can't spread yourself too widely, and it helps to achieve objectives. And we found in the case of Cape Town specifically that data management is crucial, and data management is what do we know, what don't we know, and what is necessary to know to inform monitoring whether we are achieving the impacts that we set out to achieve. And best practice, trying new methods, be innovative to get to the end result as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And then communication between the different role players are essential. When we come to the last question is, what will it cost? There are 3 fundamental questions to answer. Is, what are the funding requirements? In other words, how much do we need? Secondly is, where will we get the funding from? And then finally, what type of mechanism will we use to get those resources, deploy them to achieve the objectives? And in some cases, we need to understand who are the potential, where the potential source of funding comes from, because we're bringing upstream landowners who may be conservation land or agricultural land, together with downstream users that can be large municipalities, but not in all cases, as Colin mentioned in his talk. So where would the funding come from? So, and finally, I want to just quickly talk to you about a project that the Nature Conservancy is busy with. We received funding to help us figure out what would be a financing model that we can that's replicable in other parts of Africa. And Cape Town Waterfront is the pilot. We're doing this pilot study in Cape Town. The team will be here the first week of June, and we're going to test some key assumptions. If one put a certain amount in a fund, how quickly can we get to the end result? We're going to look at a cost module, how will the costs unlock benefits, and look at some financial projections. And the outcome of this study will help us when we communicate with funders. It will help us communicate to our partners, stakeholders, and the steering committee. That's everything from my side. Florence, I didn't check the clock, but I hope I'm on time.
Yeah, you're right on time. Thank you, Louise, for the great presentation. That was amazing. I'm sure everyone liked it. So as I had said earlier, let's all type in questions. If it's for Louise, for Colin, state it's for Louise, then you type your question so that it doesn't miss, you might all get forgotten, then you'll have to answer them later for 15 minutes. So kindly let us all join the chat and type our questions. So we'll have Segoa preparing as everyone continues typing their questions on the chat. Segoa?
Segoa, are you still on mute?
I'm on mute.
Oh,
Yeah. Hello, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Segoa.
Yes, it's me now. Eh?
Yeah, it's you. You can prepare and start sharing your screen. If you have problems, I can help with the sharing. Thank you.
Can you share from that side?
Okay, sure, of course. In a minute.
Okay. I hope you have the right one.
Yes.
Otherwise, how is Botswana?
Yeah, we are doing fine. It's getting cooler. And how is TZ?
It's raining, so, you know, our rivers look exactly like that right now, probably flooding more.
Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to whoever, you know, across the globe. I will be talking about the Okavango. It's a new geography, so unlike Louise, I'll not be going to the lessons that we've learned, but I will sort of just explaining where we are and you know what we want to do. For those who might not know, the Okavango basin is a shared river basin. It falls under what Colin called iconic. We still need to be advised in terms of whether that's the right terminology or not. But it is a very interesting landscape and typical and classical ones that you know this water fund model confirm to, which is you have a very clear upstream, you know, where you need protection, where the water is coming from, and important users. So downstream, and in this case, it will be tourism in Botswana. So the basin itself is it's a low nutrient poor system. I mean, it's a nutrient poor system. and the water moves very slowly across the entire landscape. Very low topographic relief, and it's primarily based on a flood pulse that comes through the system. The flood takes about 6 months from source to where it terminates in the Okavango Delta, where it forms this expanse, marshlands that supports, high biodiversity, especially the elephant populations, which is, one of the largest in the African continent, is found in the Okavango Delta in the Botswana part of the system. And then coupled with that, you have, higher levels of poverty, across the 3 member states that share, the water course. And of course, based on that, still moving on, it's a basin where we still sort of need development. There's a rural population that requires development across all the 3 countries. There's a thriving tourism industry in Botswana, which is dependent on the ecosystem, the goods and services that are supplied by the waters that come from upstream, of which 95% of this water is generated from Angola, which is an upstream country where there's higher rainfall. And therefore, in order to deal with some of the challenges that we are talking about, especially poverty and development needs, countries are under pressure to, come up with some infrastructure projects to deal with those, such as hydropower for energy generation, irrigated agriculture to produce food, and then, of course, within these 3 riparian countries, Namibia and Botswana, they are water-stressed countries, and therefore, there's this demand for even interbasin water transfers from the Okavango into other, river basins, such as Windhoek and also in the Kubalai system in Angola. And the way people use the resources, there's a heightened level of, forest degradation. And the situation is that there's not very, as of now, there's no strategy, that is very clear, systematic, structured to ensure that where the water is coming from is protected, and the system will continue giving us the water that we need downstream. And the water as it comes also has got another important element in terms of transportation of sediments, which are very critical for maintaining the ecosystems downstream, which are supporting these rich wildlife populations. In terms of what is obtained on the ground and what are the key issues that we want to address with initiatives like the one that we are doing within the TNC, is there are poverty is a major driver. Population increase, especially with repopulation from after the end of the civil war in Angola, people are moving back into the catchment, and therefore facilitating a lot of changes in land use and land cover. And of course, superimposed on all this is climate change. And with the areas, all these elements will actually have an impact on the system one way or the other. One is if you do infrastructure development, you're obviously going to alter the hydrological flow, and as well as the sediment dynamics. And if there's unmanaged development, there will be issues around water quality. It will deteriorate, and then the system might move from oligotrophic to a system which has got elevated levels of nutrient, and then that will upset the ecosystem functioning. And of course, biodiversity is a critical area that we're all concerned about. And in the upper catchment, that's where you have higher populations, especially in Angola. You've seen there's a pressure on the resource in terms of deforestation, some subsistence agriculture, use of fire in the upper catchment. So there's a host of problems that will affect the ecosystem functioning and the freshwater resources. And then to deal with these issues, in the past there was a thinking around maybe a payment for ecosystem services scheme, where the downstream users, especially the tour operators, could actually help finance some of the activities in the upstream that are, geared towards conserving, the source water areas. But then the challenge was then PS scheme normally, is very much dependent on robust institutions, because you have to have contracts that are honored between those who provide the service and those who receive the service. And the payment mechanism becomes a little bit complicated. So then the idea was then, what other mechanism can we, pursue that can assist with financing some of those interventions upstream where there's, observable, high levels of degradation. And that's when the countries moved to this concept of, an endowment fund, which will be linked to, it really links very well with, the source water protection strategy in the sense that the idea is to, finance conservation and livelihoods activities in the upper catchment that will ensure that the water, flows in the right quantity and the right quality to sustain ecosystems downstream, especially the Okavango Delta. So the idea was that this fund would actually help with the, making sure that there's proper forest management. Where there's degradation of forest, there's forest restoration, and so forth and so forth. So this is currently in the design mode. We are having a workshop next week where we will be sort of having a technical workshop on the business case to really sort of, inform the development of this fund. And the business case actually will help, hopefully, if we pull it quite nicely, which I think we will. We've assembled a very good team of experts and helping us put this based on the TNC experience. It will obviously be a tool that we can use for fundraising. We can also use to, inform investments that, have a conservation outcome and a livelihood improvement component to it. And in this instance, the member states or OCACOM really sort of focused on this constitution and the establishment document side of things and governance, but then TNC is coming in here to provide the science to assist with the establishment, with this, endowment fund, especially coming up with a clear business case for setting up this endowment fund for the Okavango River Basin. And we've also are now helping in terms of capacity building. Luis hosted us last year as a team of members from the Okavango Basin to take part in the water funds training that was held in Cape Town, and Fred as well hosted some of the delegates in 2017 on the Upper Tana Nairobi water fund. And TNC is offering its technical support through the in-house expertise, and hopefully we might also expose some of the the members to a model that is already bearing fruits and delivering a lot of benefits in terms of an exchange to Brazil. I think it's Sao Paulo. Colin will help me there in terms of the geography of where this model has actually been implemented. I think in conclusion, the idea behind this is to make sure that there's proper land use and proper investments activities, primarily through green infrastructure in the upper catchment, and then deliver some of those benefits downstream in terms of the water of the right quality, the right quantity, and as well, what is also important, the timing of the flow. You don't want to a heavily regulated system you want a free-flowing, iconic river basin in the form of, the Okavango, as Colin calls it, iconic. I think I hope I'm on time. I was just sort of running through my slides, but thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Segoa, for the great presentation. So now we have 10 minutes, which we'll take to answer the questions. We have a few questions from the chat. So they are addressed. We can start with the question that was asked from Emily, and I'll give Fred the chance to moderate the question and answer time. Fred?
Thank you. Thank you. I think first of all is to acknowledge very informative presentations that we just received from our very accomplished colleagues. I also want to acknowledge that our participation has grown, and I know a few people are sitting with others to at least over 33, 34 connections, which is really good that the Zoom connection that you set up, Florence, is working very well. I think let's go to the questions on the chat. We'll start with the questions from Emily, 2 questions for Colin. I'll move on to give a chance after that to Paul. I'd like Paul to introduce himself a bit and seek that link with Cape Town, and then I'll come for the next round of questions. Colin, you've seen the question?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the situation analysis, what the actual data that I showed was for the source water areas, so upstream of the intake points for each of those cities as best we can determine it. And so then the question is, what's behind that information? For example, if it's forested, is that the actual natural situation? How degraded that forest? And that's a great question. So that's really the next level of analysis that we do in the feasibility and in some cases the design phases of the water funds. So we are not doing any we haven't done any additional assessments in all 50 cities to evaluate kind of the quality and the relative naturalness of that land cover. So maybe move it over to Paul.
Paul, if you're there, please introduce yourself, and also let me see if the answer you got from Luis is satisfactory.
Paul, I think
we could just have Louise answer the question, Fred, huh?
Yeah. Luis, you can answer, and then now Paul is still on mute. If Paul, you can hear me, from Freetown, Sierra Leone. We want to hear something from West Africa before we cross. So, but Luis, go ahead with the question.
There you go. Yeah, there you go.
Thank
Hi, Fred. How are you? Good
Paul.
to see you again.
Okay, Paul. So, Paul, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Luis can answer you quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Paul Eames here, and Lisa Gaylord also from Catholic Relief Services here in Freetown, Sierra Leone. We hosted Fred recently, and we're at the kind of initial stages of scoping out a business case for a water fund. Freetown Peninsula has a rainforest catchment area with dams and protected areas, and then a very, very hilly city going down to mangroves and slums around the water's edge. So it's kind of visually and geographically very very suitable for a water fund approach. The challenge here will be financing models, because Sierra Leone is an extremely economically undeveloped environment, and despite a lot of goodwill and good leadership, there's not a lot of money here. So we're very interested in looking at different funding models.
Paul, that's quite interesting and so relevant, as I mentioned, that funding, and Colin also referred to funding being crucial for water funds. So it's a year-long project. We just started, so we expect the results to be available soon next year. But what I am willing, what I suggest is that I share the concept note of the study with Fred, which he can pass on to you, so that you can have a better understanding of what goes into it, and happy to, wherever required, be on the other side of the line should you have any questions. So I will share it with you if it's helpful.
Thank you very much. It would be extremely useful. I mean, we'll be developing the business case over the next year, and you know, the models around possible funding. I mean, the partnerships, I think, are fairly clear, and we have a lot of very exciting partnerships, as well as a very appealing environment here. But it would be extremely interesting to review what other funding models in Africa particularly could be considered. So thank you very much. That would be great.
Maybe just a quick one, Paul. Thanks for that. What's the biodiversity importance of the catchment where the water from Freetown comes from?
You said
my question.
Biodiversity.
Yes.
So basically, there's a chain of hills stretching back out of central Freetown. It's a West Guinea forest environment, biodiversity hotspot, and a national park. It has wild chimpanzees as the kind of keystone species, which is also the national animal of Sierra Leone now. So there's a lot of interest from the government, both in the biodiversity aspect as well as in the water conservation and catchment aspect.
Okay, the reason I'm asking that question is that in the Okavango we have a sort of a similar type of approach where we are trying to expand the downstream users to include even sort of the global community through like an endowment fund of some sort, so that you're not only looking at the downstream water users, but also you are using the biodiversity hotspots and the global appeal to look for resources.
Okay, it's a good suggestion. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good suggestion. I spent many years in Madagascar, so we definitely use that aspect in mobilizing funding. And so I think that that's a very good suggestion that you provided as looking at opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much, Sakawa, and thank you very much, the team in Freetown. Please feel encouraged. Everybody in this team wishes you success, and we'll start by doing the link with Ruiz, that you work on the financial models together. We had another question by Irene. Irene Muduka wanted to know from Corinne what makes a difference between a TNC-led and a partner-led water fund, and if there are advantages, distinct advantages for NSO. Corinne, do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it's a good question. So the distinction, as I talked about in my call, was that TNC-led is just what it sounds like. We try to play the lead catalyzing role for fundraising and taking the project through the water fund cycle till the point where it can be a separate institution on its own. We don't have a lot of experience with partner-led water funds, so we can't say one works better or worse. The goal is that they all work equally as well. But we just heard from Freetown, from Catholic Relief Services, leading a water fund for Freetown, Sierra Leone. We've got Moraine from Living Lands on the call, from the Algoa Water Fund, and other partner-led water funds on the call. So it's we are still learning how both TNC best supports partners and how partners best build their own capacity. And in the end, as we've talked about, the biggest challenge is going to be consistent financing. TNC as an organization benefits from a large private donor base, which not all organizations around the world can tap into. So we have to sort out that financing piece. to make sure that partners are successful.
Thank you, Colin. Again, pause. I think there are several other questions coming in now. I want to promise that we'll take all the questions. There are several compliments that we've also received all the way from Latin America, Bogota, and Guzman, and several other people. Florence will take up the questions, seek answers from all the direct people they are directed to, and to include them in your communication to you. At this stage, we are at the top of the hour, so I'll probably just want to check if you have a quick announcement from any member of this network, and then probably we'll close in a minute or two. I'll put details about Nairobi 2020, Africa Water Security Congress, 27th to the 30th of April 2020 on the chat box. Please mark the date, put it in the diary, and plan to attend. Any other announcements? Going once? Going twice? I think now, Florence, is your time to give a vote of thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Fred. That was great. At least we got to answer most of the questions, and they were very interesting. I'm very happy to see everyone is interested in what we are doing, and it's really encouraging to me and the other organizers that we have in this call. So thank you for that. Also, thank you all for making time to join this call. I'm sure you had other things to do, but you made this a priority. We appreciate that very much. And as for the call recording, we'll be sharing the recording later. I'll also share the presentations from all our presenters today, and also get to answer more of the questions. And if you have any other question, feel free to email me or Fred, and then we can have them answered and you get your questions, your answers right away. So thank you very much, and I appreciate all of you, and thank you to our most newest members. I'm really excited to have more new members. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Have a lovely day, guys.